Okay, so this is sort of a continuation of what I was doing the other day on a live stream, messing with these bell cranks. And I'm not sure what happened at the end of the stream, but something timed out, the server, the camera, the batteries or something. But basically for the most part, I was done laying up the bell crank. The only thing you missed that I was going to show in that stream was me actually putting the cap on top of this bell crank mold. So I just went ahead and clamped this up. So today I'm going to take this out of the mold and show you how the bell crank comes out of it. Sometimes it's easier than others. Another thing I'm going to try to do is I've got this landing gear. This was for an RC plane, and this is a mold. So this was a pour I did previously. This mold was made in a pour this way. And I formed this plug up, this right here. You can see the landing gear in there. That's a mock-up of exactly what I wanted out of carbon fiber. So I was able to form this part of the mold, and the carbon fiber gear's still in here. And I put the PVA on this part, and what I'm going to attempt to do today is shore up the sides of this mold, and then probably not pour it, but I might get to that point. But I'd like to at least put the surface coat on inside the mold. So we'll go over that. You've already seen me lay up these things. This was the bell crank molds, so I probably won't do any more of those on camera. A little redundant there. So let's go ahead and pop this thing out of the mold. Hopefully it comes out easy. Let me move my camera around a little bit. These clamps are probably overkill, but they work well. I bought these, probably use them in woodworking, some of the stuff where you're doing bent laminations and so forth. But they work out well for these molds. The other thing, if you're doing a three-bladed prop, you're trying to get into the center of the mold by the pin. It's got a nice wide jaw on it, or a deep jaw. Okay, the first process is to get these pins out. Usually what happens when you pull the pins, the bell crank will release from the mold and it'll stick to this plate. So this plate is UHMW. Looks like 3/8. You could probably go to half. I wouldn't go any less than 3/8. Even though it's UHMW, I still wax it. So get me a pair of these trusty Nip-X. And what I do, I give it a twist and then pull. And these pins have been waxed previously. One thing that helps too, if you can scrape a little bit of this epoxy off the pins. Now this just came out of the warming box. It's about 90 degrees. And one of the things I've noticed with this molding stuff If you pull it out, it's about 100, you know, maybe 90 degrees, and you let them cool. I've had trouble getting the pins out once it's cool. As you can see, it took some force to get that pin out, but it'll come out. Just make sure you wax it really well. Now this razor blade, it's been dulled. A lot of times when I use these as scrapers, I'll take some sandpaper like that. I'll take the edge off of it so it's not actually digging into the drill rod. Every part you make, depending on the geometry and what you're doing, it'll demold different. Some of these pins, I've got a little 90-degree bend on them, which helps get a little bit more surface area, so I recommend that. Usually at this point, I just tap it, and you can usually hear it break loose. And then to clean up the mold, and a lot of times I just go around and scrape, and it flakes off. Try to get your PVA mold release all the way to the edge, around the corners to the sides. Now this mold, it's a white, obviously it's a different color than the others. The others are gray aluminum filled. And when I was making these bell cranks, I'd get a sample of resin or urethane or whatever it might be, and I'd use the samples to make molds just to see what kind of properties or how well it worked. Now it's been so long I can't remember what this white stuff is. I think it's a urethane casting resin, and I've made some parts out of this before, so I knew it worked, but the PVAs pretty much make anything foolproof as far as the release, wax and PVA. So there's that. Now with this UHMW, it's sort of translucent, where you can see over here it's released. Over here you can see it's still dark, and just sort of, you can see where it's already released. Now what will happen on this bell crank, these holes are oversized, so as the pins come up through this mold and you put this plate on the top of it, extra resin will actually ooze out through these holes, and of course it hardens. So that's one of the reasons the bell crank sticks to the UHMW plate. And the next step is I take a pin, it's a piece of music wire, this is, it's been tapered, chamfered on the edge, and I put it in this bigger hole. So this music wire diameter is even a little bit bigger than this in the mold, so this doesn't affect the brass bushing. Give it a couple pops and that'll release the bell crank from the plate. And then I just go around with the dull razor and I scrape the resin off that's stuck. So the guy says, thanks for doing the videos. Great to see the process in action. It's Brent. And Sparky says he's glad to see me out of the chair. Okay. So at this point, I'll take another piece of music wire, which is the same diameter as this brass tube over the 1/8 inch. And I'll take that music wire, and what I'll do is I'll just knock these little resin globs out of the hole. And that's all there is to it. So basically at this point, you slap a little bit more wax on this thing, and then I'll always wax this again, and you're ready to PVA it. Wipe another coat of wax on these pins, and I insert them in there, spray the PVA, and then once the PVA is in there, then you gel coat it, put that in there. You can use Cabosil, milled fiber, anything that makes it a little bit thicker that turns it into a gel coat. And I also use this is an old can of fiberglass. It's a color pigment, and it only takes just a small dab. So if you have 10 grams of resin, you just have a little black pigment about the size of this little tube I popped out. Doesn't take much. Mix it up, and it's all cosmetic. Now once you get the bell crank at this stage, what I normally do is I don't do anything to them. I just let them pile up, and usually I'd get a stack of them, and then I'd run them under some warm water, which would actually clean the PVA off. It sort of looks glossy now, but once you clean the PVA off, you're going to see a matte finish on the part. The flashing, as you can see, it's cracking off. And what I do at this point, I've got a pair of surgical scissors with carbide inserts. I'd go around and trim it, but this is just a regular pair of scissors. You can actually get pretty close with these scissors. Your flashing, ideally, shouldn't be very thick. This is, I don't know, it's probably less than 1/64. I had them clamped pretty tight. So it's pretty thin. You just want to make sure that you get the squeeze out. You want to overfill the mold just a little bit. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but I used chopped carbon right here, sprinkled over the top, tamped it down. And what that does is when it's clamping down, it sort of holds everything together better. You don't get the washout. But right before you close the mold, you can press it all in there tight, put a little chop on it, work it down, clamp it, and then you're good to go. So this button here, it sticks out, and what I was doing on some of the bell cranks that I was making later on, I'd leave that button sticking out. It just gave me more pivot, more, what I want to say, more stability. So I'd leave that sticking out instead of being flush. And I think it helped. Now one of the things, I got a mold, I got it laying around here somewhere. It's a prototype. It's the same type bell crank, but it gets thicker here. So the idea was, instead of a 2-part mold, which is the bell crank and the plate, this mold was going to be really a 4-part mold, where I was going to lay up the carbon. Once the carbon was laid up halfway, there was going to be a metal plate or a phenolic plate or a UHMW plate or something that was going to go in here like that, and I was going to put 2 screws and screw that down into the mold, and that would in turn sink down, and maybe an 1/8 inch thick. I'm not sure the dimension of these plates, but what would happen then, I'd continue to lay up the carbon bell crank, and then when I do that, the other side of the mold would be flat, except right in here it would come up, so I would actually be molding in the top of the fork right here. And then the demold would be the same. Pull the pins out, pull the plate off. Then I would actually unscrew these 2 plates here, and then I'd pop the bell crank out. The plates that I had molded into the bell crank here would come with it. So as the bell crank came out of the mold, then I'd actually pop these plates out here, which would reveal the fork. So it'd be the same process. All I'd have to do is add those 2 plates, screw them down halfway through the layup, finish the layup, and then top mold it. One of the things I did a while back, I sort of experimented. This is another bell crank mold, but the difference with this mold versus that, there is no UHMW plate. This is the top plate. The reason I made this top plate versus a UHMW, I wanted to actually mold in the top button. So there'd be a button here, and then there'd be a button on this side. So it's sort of like an experiment, you know, just to see how it all come together. So if you can imagine this right here with the plate molded in for the fork, like there, you'd screw that down. This part of the mold would be flat, except for the area where the fork is. It would be inset like this button. So then you'd put extra carbon here. It would wind around the pin just like the carbon on the bottom. And basically this would all be filled with carbon like this would be. Then the mold would go together. You clamp it. This would pop open. You'd unscrew the plates here that you'd have for the fork on each side, so that way when you pull the pins out and you pull the bell crank out, the plate comes with it, and then the plate comes out of the fork. So is it worth it? Probably not, but it's fun to do. It was just a challenge, you know. I'll do it, but just to say I could do it. It's just fun to figure out different ways of doing it. So anyway, once you get the bell crank at this point, you clean the PVA off, and then what I do is I usually take a Dremel with a carbide burr, and then I'll actually grind all this out. And then you can take a sanding block, you can sand the edges. And then of course then it's time to bush the holes or do whatever you want to do there. So that's that. That's with bell crank. I'll clean these pins up, put them back in the little box. Sometimes you don't have to clean them all the time, each time, but I always do. Okay, the other thing I wanted to go over today is this landing gear thing. Now, the gear that I'm actually making here, the mold, it's for a radio control airplane, more like a sort of a fun fly airplane. But The process on this gear mold is the same as what I was doing on the molds for the control line airplanes. Alright, so this is part A, part B of the mold, whatever you want to call it. The carbon gear I stuck back in the mold, took it out, waxed it, cleaned it, and sealed up the edge with wax and maybe clay and made it tight. And then I sprayed PVA on it. And I've got it on a hard drive somewhere. I might have lost it where I was actually pouring this part of the mold. And I don't know what happened to it. I can't find it. But anyway, what I did is I made a form that held this gear. And let me see if I can find it real quick. Go over here in my junk pile. Look at that. It's right under L for landing gear. Okay, so this is the form I made. And there's nothing special. It's just Formica melamine. And get the thinnest, cheapest stuff you can get, because basically this curve right here was almost in there. It's really thin, so it conforms really nice. So what I did is I took that carbon gear that is actually sitting here, and I formed this Formica dam, I guess you'd call it, or parting board on the carbon gear. And to do that, you can put wax on it, you can put hot melt glue, anything that's not permanent, clay, to hold this onto the gear and get it where you want it. And then I came over here and then I used carbon tow, fiberglass, CA, whatever you want to do. But by doing that, it allows this to be, I guess, permanently held in this shape. So if I need to make more molds, I'd take this gear out, I'd put it in this form, and once the gear is in this form, you clay it up. So you'll put the gear in there, you'll pack clay underneath it, and then you'll take a dull knife and you'll scrape the clay out from the side of the gear, which in turn will give you this draft angle here, because you have to have the angle here out, so when this part of the mold comes over the top, it'll release. You can see this mold where it has dips in it, and those dips were caused by exotherm, where the resin got too hot and it shrunk, but it didn't affect the actual mold because the face of the mold and everything around the gear was right. So this stuff here, I got that as scrap somewhere, I can't remember where. Here's some more I got. This was in the last month, couple months. I was on a job, a commercial job, where they are doing cabinets. And here's some thin, I call it Formica, melamine, I don't know, there's a lot of names for it. It's got a sort of a satin finish on it, sort of like a brush steel. And it's really thin. They use it to wrap forms around curved cabinets in industrial applications. This was in the dumpster. Once they take this stuff and they cut it, it's broken a little bit, they'll cut it up, it's scrap, they'll throw it out. So if you can go to a cabinet shop and say, hey, can I get some scrap for 20 bucks or something, they'll probably load you up. So basically you take this, and then this will help you form different shapes. So Formica for what I want to say, rib templates or foam cutting templates, you want it to be thicker and flat. Some of it's flat for like countertops, There's also a type that's thinner for bending, and it's cheap. I mean, you can get it for nothing if you can find the scrap. So this is what I make actual foam cutting templates out of. It's thicker and it lays flat. This is curved, so obviously. Okay, so it pretty much shows you how I got the landing gear formed up in this. Once you get the gear formed up, then you build a wall, a box, whatever you want to call it. And it doesn't matter as long as it's somewhat rigid and it's flat and it's smooth. This is Lexan, I believe. Okay. So just pretend the carbon gear is in this mold form. It's clayed up with a draft angle. And this Lexan side is clamped onto the box like this. Made a box out of it. And then brace it up, you know, put the clamps at the bottom, make sure it doesn't fall over. And then once you get this clamp, then you take like a surface coat, or you can just do the regular pour, but I like the surface coat because it fills the hairline gaps and it gives you a better finish. You'll take an acid brush on a dowel rod to get down in there if you're doing the surface coat. Brush that on, and then what you do, and it goes pretty quick, within an hour or two you can actually pour the cast, and then you'll pour this. You'll wait a day or so, a couple days, let it cure. You'll pop these off. And then once you do that, you'll have this mold, and I like to take the gear out of it. Now, some people say leave it in there, don't remove it, and that's probably good. I've done it both ways. But if the gear comes out, don't worry. Put it back down in there, and with some wax and clay, and seal it up good till you get it to this point. And once you get it to this stage, you put the PVA on it, you wax it, get the wax down in the cracks, PVA it. And now it's time to pour the top half of the mold. So everything's different. I mean, it doesn't matter. You'll make a dozen landing gear. You probably have, if it's a different gear, you're going to make a dozen different forms. So these forms were made with little ears on them. And what I did, I put those ears at the right height here to where, I don't know if you can see it or not. Let me point the camera down. Hopefully you can see that the ears come out and they butt up to this mold right where the bend is, right here. It's like right here. So in effect, once this mold is made, and I guess you could say it'll be a 4-part mold technically. So you're going to have these dams out here like this, the plexiglass on the sides. So then you got a top and a bottom half. You'll wet the carbon out when you're actually making the landing gear, and you'll lay it over the mold, and you'll have more carbon here, and as you go out towards the tip of the axle, the carbon will diminish just like a prop. And then you'll clamp top and bottom, okay, which will form all this. Now when it comes time to closing the mold, you're going to put on this flat surface right here, you're going to put little plates. You can use UHMW. I have little aluminum plates. So let's just say this is a plate. You put it here, and then you put one here. So you'll clamp top and bottom. You put the plates on and you'll clamp side to side. And the neat thing about clamping side by side, you can actually fill in this area with more weave, or you can put plates on there. You can beef it up a little bit there for an axle by putting that underneath the plates here. So you can vary that, where this here you can't really vary. Alright, so what I'm going to try to do, I've got some surface coat in here in the hot box. Let's see if I can clamp this thing up and make a box out of it. The other thing I'm not sure of is if I have my bigger scale. I'm not sure if the batteries are still good in it. It takes like 6 D-cell batteries. It's a scale I use to weigh heavier stuff, and it'll go from a ½ gram all the way up to 30 pounds with a ½ gram resolution. It's electronic. So I'm just gonna sort of tape this up a little bit to hold it. So it'll be in real time. I guess you can watch the struggle. And this tape right now is just temporary. I just want to hold these vertical somewhat. Okay, I've already waxed this. I've got the tape on the inside where I waxed, and to be honest with you, that was so many years ago, or at least a year. So let's do this. Let's put a little bit more wax on these plates. That ought to do it. Okay, that's enough wax for a whole bunch of stuff. What I'll do with all this extra wax, I might as well put another coat on these bell crank molds. Won't waste it. Can you put too much wax on there? Probably not. Let's see where I can set this. Like I said, I got tape. Let me know where the inside is. So by waxing these things, put it on real heavy like that. And what'll happen if you let this wax dry, it's hard to get off. And if you get the wax to where it's dried, you just get more wax that's wet, and you rub it down, and then it'll reconstitute the wax where you can wipe it. I'll let that dry a little bit, and might as well rub some on this mold while I'm at it. Come down the sides and then buff it. Make sure I get it in that button. That's all there is to that. Okay. a mold like this, it doesn't matter if it's streaky. It really doesn't matter if this is scratched up. You know, you'll get scratches in this stuff. It ain't gonna hurt anything. It's just a form for your mold. Now, if you're actually molding the part on something like this, you'd want it to be blemish free, but when you're making up a box mold, it's not that critical. Now, if you didn't want to use wax, you could use something like a free coat, or there's other spray-on things that work out well. Now, on this, since it's not porous and I don't go through many cycles on making the actual mold, I don't worry about using the PVA on this. I pretty much just go with just the wax and never had any trouble. And then the UHMW plate gets more wax. The neat thing about composites, you know, if you're really in the, what do I want to say, in the composite mode, when you start waxing or you start putting different things together, you can start doing multiple things. It's like I had extra wax here. I just started putting it on a mold. And one of the things you didn't see, when I put this gel coat in these bellcrank molds, this resin was left over from making the bellcrank. All I did is add a little bit of black pigment to it. And then once I added the black pigment, then I started putting the gel coat in. So I guess you could say I wasn't wasting any of the resin. Now I'm pulling off a little bit of the PVA on where the tape is, but that's all right. All right. Make this box. Okay, let me get my clamps here. So what I'm going to try to do is leave these clamps flat on the table. And by doing that, they'll act as like little feet. Get this set right. This is where you really need 4 hands. Once I get this first clamp on, I'll be good. All right. Let's see what this is. That'll be good. Okay, first clamp's a charm. One of the nice things though, if you have a designated composite table, you don't have as much clutter. Like I said, let the clamp rest against the bench here. So that acts like a foot. And then once it's sitting on the bench, you can actually prop these long clamp arms up. I got shorter clamps over there, but I'm not going to dig them out. Some people, they'll use hot melt glue too. I mean, they'll run a bead of it around there. Since I'm doing the surface coat thing, it'll seal up all the little cracks, and I'm not too worried about that. And really, if you're looking at this doesn't even have to be perfectly vertical. I mean, obviously it has to be tight enough to where when you pour the resin in, it's not going to flop out. That's the main thing. The other thing the surface coat does, when you actually put the surface coat around these seams, it locks it all tight to where it sort of glues it together, so that way you have less chance of, let's just say, this part of the mold flopping over and everything leaking out. It's the same thing with a concrete mold. If you're pouring a concrete stairs and you're not formed up right, and one of those boards busts loose and it just all runs out, same thing here. You got to make sure that, you know, that thing's where it needs to be and tight. So these are right angles in a degree. So I'm just going to line them up with the edge. I'm not going to put a triangle on them or anything. So let me get some more clamps on this thing. Might as well use these. Let's see, I think I'm going to put 2 of them on. So here it's pretty obvious where the extra reach helps on these clamps. So that looks like it's pretty close. Now I'm going to tighten this up here. I need some more clamps on the side. All of this around here looks good. And if you had a little bit of ooze out, I mean, it's not a game changer. A little bit won't hurt. See if these 99-cent clamps come in handy. Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect. Put one more down at the bottom over there. So once I get this thing with the surface coat on it, I'll jump over there on these other bell cranks and I'll finish those up today, lay those up. And if you want to see a bell crank laid up, you saw the demold, but if you want to see it laid up, you can look at the last live feed I did. It's on there. Whoop, got it too tight. Have to glue this ear back on. Yeah, that clamp was putting a lot of force on it. So I'm going to glue this back on here. It's not critical, all it is a little resin dam. I think if I was going to do a dozen molds, I'd probably come up with a better method that was repeatable versus all this. But when I did the bell crank molds, I made it sort of like a repeatable box where I screw the sides together and everything. I'm not sure if I put wax on these or not. Here's the other thing. When you make a mold like this, let's just say you forget to wax these Formica pieces here. They become glued to the actual mold. It's really not that big a deal. You could just leave them on the mold and just make them sacrificial, I guess. Okay, what I'm going to do, since that didn't like 2 clamps, I'm going to put 1 clamp in the middle instead of 2. See if I can get this thing to work. I guess it's better it pops off now than later. Once the gel coat's on there, or the surface coat, that's the main thing. I'm going to make sure that I got this one done too with some wax. Let me go ahead and do this one too. Alrighty, I think I'm back to square one. 10 minutes later. Alrighty. About as good as it's going to get right there. All right. So next step is to mix up some surface coat. I'll take an acid brush and I'll put it on a dowel rod. That'll allow me to brush the surface coat down in there. Got me a scrap piece of carbon. Well, I'll tell you what, you do these live streams on a Monday afternoon, pretty quiet. So this will allow me to get down in there with that surface coat. Like I said, this has already been PVA'd. I think I'm good to go now. So, the surface coat, and I'm not sure what I used on this. It does have a surface coat on it, I think, but I can't remember what it was. But what I'm going to do today is a high temp surface coat. Now see, you can use these wax rags to wipe your bench down and buff them out. That way when the CA gets on your glass, it comes right off. Okay, let's see if I can move this over a little bit. And I think once I get the surface coat on, that's when I'll cut the stream off, and then we'll go to I'll go to laying up some bell cranks off camera. And then I'll turn the stream back on at another time when I actually do the pour. And I think probably the gram scale will be good enough to actually mix up the surface coat. Probably won't handle the pour. So we're good to go today with just the gram scale. I'll check the batteries on the bigger scale. Let's see here. Some of this stuff over there. I thought about actually getting this a little bit more organized. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to wing it. Okay. I got that where I need it. Got me some more room. Get in my warmer box. Get me some HSC 302X. And some hardener. So I keep this in that box. It's probably about 90 degrees in there. I've got a heated garage, but you know, if it's 7 degrees or 7 below zero, when you come out in the garage, it's 50, 55. So I keep a warmer box. Underneath this bench I'm working on is a hollow metal box, and that's where I keep the epoxy resins and stuff. So here's a surface coat, and just for the technical data here, let's look what they say about surface coats here. HSC 302. Okay. High temperature surface coat, it's aluminum filled. And ratio by weight, 100 parts per hundredweight to 1600 16%. Now, the lady at Resin Surfaces told me 12% on 302X. Okay, this is HS3 302X. So evidently they changed the formula. Instead of 16% per hundredweight to 12% per hundredweight per Linda at Resin Services. So we're going to go with the 12%. And I made a note of that in this this reference page. Ratio by volume 3.9 to 1. It's a lot easier to do it by weight. Pot life of this surface coat at 72 degrees, 200 gram mass is 18 minutes. So it gives you a fair amount of time. 200 gram mass isn't very much. Now this stuff, the Shore D at 350 degrees Fahrenheit is 70. So this is a high temp surface coat. So let's say you're making carbon fiber props or gear or something and you wanted a really good finish, but you wanted a high temp mold. This is what I'd use personally. So as long as your surface coat matches your casting resin as far as heat deflection and the properties as far as heat goes, you should be able to, cycle this thing in and out of an oven. So these two together, the recommended post-cure is an hour at 150, 1 hour at 250, and 1 hour at 300 degrees. So in effect, once you got all this stuff made up into a mold, if you're post-curing at 300, you should be able to make parts at 200, 250 all day long. So it's a high temp mold material. It goes on a density mix, specific gravity, a whole lot of different stuff. So anyway, let's go with 12%. And get a pen. I'm going to need a pen to start marking stuff down. Okay, we're going to go with 12%. Now this shelf, or the pot life, I forget what I just read, but anyway, the pot life at 70-80 degrees, 18 minutes at 200 gram mass. So this is in there at 90 degrees, so it's good and warm. So let's see, let's get a cup. I'll use one of these bigger cups. This will make up enough surface coat for that mold. So let's see what the tear weight of this cup is. I hope you guys can see this stuff. Let's see what you can see. I'm trying to look in my viewfinder here. Alrighty. Okay, we're at 14 grams for a cup. Now, this stuff, since it's aluminum filled, it's probably going to need to be stirred. As a matter of fact, I know it's going to be stirred. Yeah, you can see a little bit of the resin laying on top. This nice strip of steel works out good. Now, this isn't too bad. It's settled a little bit. You can see how it's still pretty liquid. You could see the clear resin on the top of this, so I got to mix that in there. You know, out of all this stuff I do out here in the garage making videos, which isn't very much, the least amount of views usually ends up being the composite stuff. I think people watch this stuff and think, yeah, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. So even if you're not going to do this stuff, maybe it'll give you some insight, maybe on something you'd want to do with the same material. I've watched a lot of videos on YouTube that you sit there and you think, well, I'm not going to do it, but you learn something. And lo and behold, a few months later or a year, you think, sure, I'm glad I picked up that tip. You know, it comes in handy. And I'll watch a video, my wife will say, well, don't you already know all that? And I said, well, some of it. But no matter how much you know, there's always a couple things in there that you never thought of that you really put into practice that makes a difference. So here's the kind of viscosity we're looking at. And this is mixed up pretty good. So that's what the surface coat looks like. Okay, so we know we got 14 grams on this cup. So we can't put the 14 grams in with the formula. That's the tare weight. And we're going to go with 12% of this curing agent. Alright, I give up. Put the old nip X on it. You don't want to squeeze it so hard you distort the cap. What I do also on these curing agents, I don't take the cap that they ship it with that sits down in there. I take a nail and I punch 2 holes in it, because what the quantities I mix up, I don't want the whole glob coming out of there. So that's a little tip. Alright, let me get some gloves on. The other thing you find out really quick when you start doing composite stuff, it's not only the cost of the material, it's the cost of all the supplies that go into it. Gloves, paper towels, cleanup stuff. Brent mentioned me actually making a PDF file of all the products that I used in modeling for stunt, of all these different resin products, what they are, how I mix them, what they do, how they apply to the hobby. And I think he's right, I need to make up a reference. And I'm going to say this again, and people have asked me, why do you use resin services? And my reasoning behind it is it's a whole system. So there's a binder of surface coats, casting resins, laminating resins, and all these different products, and they interact and exchange really well together. And it's not widely available. People don't know about them. This is more like the stuff they'll use in Gasoline Alley here in Indy, or full-fledged